All right.
Hey, between Jamie and I, we could be quite the audience, just the two of us. Trust us.
All right. Well, we are very pleased this evening to have Mikey Ilagan with us to present on digital accessibility. Mikey is currently a product manager on the Comcast accessibility team. He's a former web designer and front-end developer, and he's spent the past decade building digital experiences using a lifetime of passion for technology. Today, he also uses his diverse background to work with product teams to ensure that Xfinity's offerings are usable and well-designed for customers using assistive technology. And he is also a co-organizer of the Philly Accessibility Meetup. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Great intro. Thanks for that.
Thank you for that.
A little bit more about me. I think you pretty much covered it all. I am an accessibility product manager here at Comcast currently. My previous role here at Comcast as a consultant was more of an accessibility specialist. So my primary focus previously was more on the testing side. So I would test products, kind of just doing that quality assurance type stuff, but with a specific focus on assistive technology and how customers and people with disabilities would be using the different products that we create here at Comcast. And so now that I've moved over to the product management side with with the same team, my focus is a little bit more on kind of managing, making stuff happen with the various product teams. One thing that makes my role as a product manager a little bit different than other product managers is that my product per se is accessibility as it relates to several products. I'm currently the point of contact for digital home, which would be our home security stuff, and XFi, which is our home kind of network software that you can go in and manage your entire home network and home internet security. And then a couple other things that I work on are customer experience products such as Xfinity Assistant, which is our chatbot for customer service. So I work with those teams. I work with product managers who kind of manage the features for those products. I work with designers and developers, roles that I had occupied previously before coming to Comcast, and helping them just create an inclusive experience that really includes people of all abilities and disabilities in the things that we're building here. As mentioned, my background is in design, web development, UX, which is user experience and UI design, and that's the stuff that I really feel most comfortable speaking to, and the space that, at least for the time being, that I occupy a lot. And yeah, I love design and I love technology. So I also love Philly and food and technology really of all kinds, and how really being where people interface with technology are the things that I'm most passionate about. So, in the past couple of years, after getting really into accessibility, it's now, trying to see how people with disabilities use technology, and that's the stuff that I'm really motivated about. In this session, I hope that you'll learn, more about digital accessibility if you're starting from nowhere. You'll have maybe, a good foundation, hopefully. And then, in the work that you're doing, regardless of what your role currently is, whether you're more on the business side or the account side, or you're a designer or developer or copywriter, or if you do a number of these things, I hope that you'll end up being more mindful and inclusive of people with a broad range of abilities. And a lot of the work that I do now, and I think as designers, we talk about this a lot. We talk about empathy. I just want to kind of broaden that concept of empathy and how we use it in the work that we do. So a little bit of an overview. If you can see the slides, I have a picture that my former CEO sent me when I was at Think Company. It is a curb cut to nowhere. It's a curb cut that just goes into a pile of stones, and I think it was taken somewhere in I want to say it was Seattle City down the shore. And this is an example, and I like using photos like this. So if you ever see anything like this and you want to randomly drop it into an email and send it to me or text it to me or whatever, I love pictures like this because, one, it's just kind of sad and ironic, but there's a lot of analogies that you can make when it comes to the digital space as well. So if you're designing a website, software application, really anything, and you're building it, portions of it can be accessible, the rest of it is not. I found out after using this photo a couple times that when we see stuff like this in physical spaces, it's a result of, like, you know, the people owning the curb cuts are not the same people working on the sidewalks. So that's how we end up with this disconnect. And you end up seeing that in the digital space as well. You have in-house teams, you have vendors, you have partners, you have contractors, you have, you know, in some cases, many cooks in the kitchen. And so we end up with this product that's not always accessible, if it's accessible at all. But, you know, to speak for accessibility, I like really distilling that concept into, it's really just the means of access, right? So it's whether people have the ability to access the information that we're presenting, the application that we're building, and really just the overall experience. In terms of audience, you know, I'll be speaking on different types of disabilities, which is a space that I feel privileged to speak about. I don't identify with a disability, but, you know, so I really recognize people of all abilities, and I think it's important to also, you know, work with those folks firsthand. If you have the opportunity to get their opinions through user research or customer feedback, very important stuff. And then assistive technology, which is a pretty broad space. And then my favorite part of this is really the conversations that we have, and really the foundation of this entire talk is really the conversations that we end up having when we do build digital experiences. And then I'll conclude after that. So what is accessibility? You know, oftentimes we'll hear that, you know, if you look it up, you'll hear that it's the practice of making your website usable by as many people as possible. You'll hear that from Mozilla makers of the Firefox browser. But web accessibility, and then you'll hear, you know, the folks who put out the web content accessibility guidelines, which are the guidelines that we use in the digital space to kind of measure whether or not something is accessible or not. They'll say that web accessibility means that website tools and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. It's getting a little bit more specific there. And then, you know, if you look up the dictionary definition, and it'll say capable of being reached, used, seen, understood, appreciated, or influenced, which makes sense. But for me, and you know, I make a lot of correlations and references to physical spaces, which I think people are more familiar with. In this space, it's like the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, except in this context, we're building the ramp to the internet. So we're allowing access to the things that we're building. That's accessibility. There's also the concept of inclusive design. So I think, you know, next time I revise this talk, I'll speak a little bit more on inclusive design and how we really consider people of all abilities from the very beginning. Because it's not always a matter of, like, you know, making that ramp or tearing down the staircase and adding a ramp next to it. It's just making sure that we have, you know, maybe a level surface for people to enter our experience from the very beginning. There's no barrier to entry from the start. So accessibility is essential for some. Some people do need certain accommodations, but it's useful for all. Everyone needs, you know, everyone has a need for access. There's a couple things that I've learned when having different conversations, working with people in the past couple of years that I've been focusing on accessibility. And there's this notion of, you know, what accessibility is or isn't. So accessibility isn't a list of restrictions. It won't force you to make a product that is ugly, boring, or cluttered. That I think is a misconception. It is, however, a list of requirements that need to be met so that a wider range of people can fully experience the things that we're building in a digital space. These requirements will give you new ideas to explore that will lead to better products for all of your users. Accessibility is sometimes special accommodations. That can be true. Sometimes we have to add on access to old, complex systems. That's like adding on ramps or separate accessible entrances onto older buildings, like I mentioned. It is, however, great inclusive design. So if we just were mindful of building an experience that was inclusive of everyone from the very beginning, not just of disability, but really the full range of human experience, which it might seem challenging at first, but if we really think about who we want to include, things would just come out a lot better. So if everything followed this philosophy, accessibility wouldn't be regarded as like this separate thing that we're doing. Everything would just be inherently accessible. So accessibility isn't hindering most users to accommodate a minority, considering accessibility makes a better experience all around. I heard someone say once that accessibility compromises the aesthetics. I have two reactions to that. Design has limitations, requirements, and constraints. If someone can't design for those factors, I'm not sure that's the fault of accessibility. Accessibility is also usable by as many people as possible. Think about curb cuts for people in wheelchairs, but also for people pulling wheeled luggage or pushing strollers or carts. Curb cuts the curb cut effect, as it's known, is an interesting example because curb cuts were really invented for people in wheelchairs, but we found that they increase road safety and overall pedestrian safety, and it's really useful if you're pushing around like a stroller or you're walking your bicycle or something like that. So while it was invented for people in wheelchairs specifically, we've just seen a lot of value come from that invention. But lastly, accessibility is a civil right, and laws like the ADA exist to uphold those rights. When you build experiences mindful of accessibility, you're maintaining the rights of others. When you don't, you honestly, from my opinion, you deny them of that equality. And then lastly, related to that previous point, accessibility is a shared social responsibility. When we work together, we'll find that the rising tide lifts all boats. So I have a little anecdote about OXO, and similar to the curb cut effect, more than 25 years ago, Sam Farber noticed his wife Bessie was having trouble comfortably holding her peeler due to arthritis. This got Sam thinking, why do ordinary kitchen tools hurt your hands? Why can't there be wonderful, comfortable, easy-to-use tools? So Sam, founder of OXO, saw an opportunity to create more thoughtful cooking tools that would benefit all users and promised Bessie that he would create a better peeler. And he's done that, and a whole range of kitchen utensils. So there are simpler things that we use all the time that were invented specifically for people with disabilities. I did mention curb cuts, but also closed captioning. Here at Comcast, we do have a lot of statistics, and we found that anyone who works in TV or really we found that closed captions are actually used by the majority of customers, whether or not they have whether or not they're hard of hearing. They're also essential in places like, even though I think my hearing is okay, they're essential if I'm in a busy or loud restaurant or bar. So we want to think about, who we're building for. I think we're always mindful of our audience. This is really, I'm going to be focusing in on folks with disabilities, kind of recenter the conversation of accessibility for those with disabilities. When we talk about disability, most numbers that you'll get are really pointing out about 20%. So about 20% of the population is affected by one or more disabilities. And so, much like accessibility, though, the way we group our audience also functions kind of on a spectrum. Everyone is different. No two people are alike. So nobody's body is going to work the same way anyone else's does. And some people may not be able to see, hear, speak, understand, or move the way other people do. So we have folks who are blind and low vision. This includes people with all forms of color blindness and any other visual impairments. These folks may have some difficulty with certain color combinations, especially if they're red-green colorblind. Some people depend on things like screen magnification software or screen readers, which I'll speak a little bit more about later. And then due to the very visual nature of the web or TV or really any digital medium, people with visual disabilities are often met with some of the greatest challenges. There are folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, so they have difficulty with audio content For example, dialogue-heavy videos without closed captioning. When we run our accessibility meetup, we always try to find a sponsor to give us live closed captioning on the spot. So people who are in our audience, especially if we are in a venue that may not have a PA system to amplify our microphone, or if we have individuals who are attending our event who are significantly or profoundly deaf, we try to hire closed captioners to help with our events. And it's a great thing for sponsors to get involved with too. So, dialogue-heavy videos are also difficult without closed captioning. Transcripts for audio content are great for accessibility. Then it's also a good example of kind of intersectionality. So, we have transcripts for things like podcasts and other audio content, but it would allow people with cognitive disabilities to also review the content or really just move along at their own pace. It even makes content crawlable by search engines. So it would allow people in other markets to do a quick Google Translate of your content into their language. There are folks with physical disabilities, so that's people with difficulty or inability to use their hands for any reason. This includes those with loss or lack of fine muscle control, people with hand tremors. Wheelchair users are also in this category, and then some people depend on different technologies that replace the need to use a mouse or a keyboard. In the advent of voice recognition, you'll encounter people using software such as Dragon Naturally Speaking. But there's other software that, I think we're in an interesting time because there's such an emergence of voice-driven AI that we're really seeing things come together in terms of helping out people with physical disabilities. But even voice-driven AI, has such an impact for anybody who, would prefer to do things hands-free, regardless of ability. And then, so moving on to the next category, we have folks with cognitive disabilities, also known as the neurodiverse. They could have disabilities that affect their memory, attention, problem solving, and logic. This includes developmental disabilities, learning disabilities, dyslexia, ADHD, and more. This is an audience that needs to be included as well. I've found personally that, this might be an audience that may be difficult to design for, but they need to be included just as much as everybody else. And then lastly, this is the category that sometimes I've seen regarded as a separate entity, sometimes not. But folks with speech and language disorders may not say sounds clearly. They may have a hoarse or raspy voice, repeat sounds, or stutter. They could be nonverbal, and the cause of this could stem from a variety of reasons. Or they may be non-fluent in a new language. And so there's also every combination of the above. People are deafblind or could have a physical disability, but also be low vision. There's really every combination of this, and as I mentioned, all this functions on a spectrum too. Blind people, might have some limited vision, or people who are deaf, but also hard of hearing. People could have limited use of their hands, but also be blind. So, someone that might be able to hear, but might be nonverbal, or even non-fluent, if either in an environment where people are speaking something that's not their native language. And then, lastly, one point I would like to add is that it's important to remember that people are people first and not necessarily defined by their disabilities. We might refer to them as screen reader users or blind or deaf, but they're people before anything else. And disability is less about the lack of ability, it's more about the lack of a solution around that disability and how we are able to accommodate and remove barriers using, especially in an age where we can use technology to solve so many things. A couple facts and figures. According to a report published by the National Service Inclusion Project, just here in the U.S., we have an estimated 48.9 million people, or 19.4% of the non-institutionalized civilians have disability. Over 24 million people have a severe disability, and over 34 million people, or 17.5% of the population, have a functional limitation. So lots of figures out there, lots of statistics, and speaking from the business end, these people should be included. It should be our customers as well. So that's one thing that we want to be mindful of. We want to include people in the things that we're doing. And then there's this notion that, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of this concept. Just from ways that I've heard it presented, but accessibility is important because, it's a minority population that some people say we can join at any time. We could grow older, we could encounter accidents or illness at a certain age. We can't expect our bodies to always work the same way. I know that, I've had difficulty with my vision, I've had LASIK. I know in that respect, I'm kind of just buying some time when it comes to my vision. So, accessibility really has benefits for everyone, and you can, you could obtain a disability at some point. I do like thinking about disability kind of on a spectrum. As I mentioned earlier, there's this concept that, you have this permanent disability, a temporal disability, or kind of a situational scenario. So you could have, one arm, you could have an arm injury that will heal, or you could be a new parent or be holding something like a baby, you could be holding your baby and be occupied otherwise. So if we're designing a product for a person with one arm, it would have applications across a whole spectrum of people that, may not have that particular disability, but they could be kind of situationally impaired. And that is, there's a lot of these examples in the Microsoft Inclusive Design Manual, which is a wonderful website. So there's other examples I wanted to share. Kind of something short-term would be, having an injury, jet lag, eye surgery, just simply being distracted. More long-term or permanent situations. You could be blind, you could be deaf, you could, have one arm, and situational, you could have eye fatigue or body ache, low light. Another example there could be like screen glare, when we're designing for folks who are blind or low vision. Maybe it's about increasing contrast so people who are low vision can see things better, but that would also help people who might have a broken screen on their phone or glare. And so I have more of those examples here as well. Oftentimes it's more about our surroundings or situation. When we think of access, I think there's definitely this connotation that it's a physical limitation on a person's body, but it's not always the case. There could be there could be a limitation just due to environmental surroundings. So, vision, working in the sun, you have a cracked screen. When it comes to mobility, you could be on a bumpy train. You could be holding groceries or an infant. When it comes to hearing, you could be in a noisy environment like a cafe, or I've never tried working out of a bar for specific reasons because it would be too noisy. I've definitely been in situations where I had to be quiet and might be working near someone sleeping, like my children. And then from a cognitive situation, it's difficult to work while distracted if someone's trying to talk to you at the same time. Or if you're working with folks who, maybe, speaking in their non-native language, or you might be working in a language that's not native to you. I was on a conference call earlier, and it was just remarkable that folks were, we were having this call across 9 time zones, and the participants were from all different backgrounds and nationalities too. So, and then we were doing this over video conference call. So there's challenges there that we need to design and accommodate for. So, the question is, what is this assistive technology? There's technology that exists that really helps close the gap between people and their environments and their disability. So it promotes greater independence by enabling people to perform tasks they were formerly unable to accomplish, or they might have had great difficulty accomplishing. It might, make enhancements or change the methods of interacting with, really adapting other technology to help them accomplish such tasks. I have an anecdote here about Stephen Hawking. So when he passed away, people were saying things that he was like a wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. Oh, whoops, sorry. But this really isn't an informed way to look at it. If anything, Stephen Hawking was kind of liberated by his wheelchair. The media fell into some pretty old cliches about wheelchair users. Wheelchairs are a tool. They're a mobility tool, if anything. Wheelchairs and other assistive technology are freeing to people with disabilities. It's a tool of freedom, as I've seen it described. And without the wheelchair, that's when people are seriously limited. Assistive technology empowers people. And then, as I mentioned, I've had LASIK, so I spent most of my life wearing prescription lenses, and no one would have ever defined me as bound to prescription lenses. And that's a perspective that needs to be reframed. Some outlets also might have described Hawking as unable to speak, and maybe he didn't do it in the traditional sense, but he definitely handled speaking just fine. I have a couple panels here, and I don't even know if this conversation actually took place, but I found it and I thought it was pretty funny. It's an interview with John Oliver, and he's saying, "You've stated that you believe there could be an infinite number of parallel universes. Does that mean there's a universe out there where I'm smarter than you?" Hawking says yes, and Hawking also followed up with, "Also a universe where you're funny." So I have examples of assistive technology here. The most common, well, actually, there is a wide range of assistive technology, but the most common is something that you may not even consider kind of like a specialized device. It's really just your everyday computer keyboard. And then there's which we have on desktop PCs and laptops and such. Everyone needs, at this point, I can make assumption that most people have used your regular computer keyboard. And not everyone is, a keyboard and mouse user. Some people are power users and prefer to just use mostly the keyboard. I mean, there was a time where computer mice didn't exist. So, and there are people who still prefer it, or that's their main option there. Along the top, you can see the pictures that I have a couple of other devices. So the next device along the top row is what's called a switch device. And so, this is kind of like a little bit more utilitarian. A person can use a switch device, and they can attach it via Bluetooth or plug it into a computer, and allows them to navigate from element to element. And then the other button would allow them to kind of like select that button. You can actually use switches in any number of configurations. There's even people who use just one switch, and basically it's kind of like whack-a-mole, and there's this cursor that moves around, and when it pauses on the thing that they want to select, then they hit the button. Or there's people who are using 3 switch setups. There's a really huge amount of configurations available. You can mount it to the headrest of a motorized wheelchair. You can use it as a foot pedal, all sorts of things. The next device is actually very similar. It has 2 large buttons, and it's called the Microsoft Adaptive Controller that Microsoft invented for their Xbox One gaming platform. And so this allows people with various physical disabilities to use switches on their Xbox. And some people kind of regarded it as an expensive, simplified controller because it retails for about $100. But comparing it to the previous device, that is actually $300. So, and even the $300 device was kind of regarded as a bargain because we found historically that assistive technology is very expensive. But for $100, a person who may previously been unable to play Xbox is now able to do that, and then they can plug in all sorts of other peripherals, joysticks or foot pedals, whatever they need to accommodate their disability. They can now play the Xbox, which is amazing. The other device is unrelated to both of these. I just found it to be kind of like the next thing to talk about in terms of hardware. It is a Braille reader, so it allows the manual input and output of Braille. So you would connect it to a computer, or you could use it as a standalone keyboard. You can read and write Braille with it. And so this might be the only way that somebody who is deafblind might be able to use a computer if they don't have if they can't hear well enough to hear a screen reader. Along the bottom row, we have people using all sorts of various devices. There's a sip and puff switch, which I personally like to call mouse joysticks because I think that's more of an accurate name. You're using a joystick basically with your mouse, and you sip to click, and you puff the right click, and you can customize how you want it to work. There's another picture featuring someone who's using eye control or eye gaze, We actually at Comcast put a web remote that's compatible with iControl technology, so you can change your TV set, your X1 cable box using our web remote, which is compatible with iControl technology. So you would look at an icon and pause, and then you can activate that button or link or whatever on the screen without using completely hands-free. Next up, we have screen readers. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I think in terms of web accessibility, it tends to be one of our focuses. So screen reader synthesizes all manner of text and interface to speech for a person who's blind to hear. So instead of kind of seeing the web page that we would as sighted people, they're kind of listening to the entire interface and listening to all the text and screen and everything on the screen. So the responsibility falls on the people in the product team, whether they are a developer or designer or product owner, to really ensure that we're prioritizing compatibility with this and other devices and ensuring that we're including people in our experience. I tell people all the time, or mostly designers, that we have to think about not only how things look, but also how they sound, because not everybody is going to be looking at the interface the same way that we do. And then lastly, there's a person using voice control technology. I mentioned Dragon naturally speaking, which is pretty popular. But then there's also implications, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to voice AI, things like Siri and Alexa and Google Home. This is a short video of a person using this switch device. I don't know how well this is going to come over, over the GoToMeeting or screen recording, but I'll give it a shot. And there's no dialogue. There's some music, but I guess that's not coming through. So what we have here is a person in a wheelchair, and they're using a headrest attachment for the Bluetooth switch from AbleNet. So it's one of the devices. Comcast doesn't make this, but we've used devices like this in the past to do different testing here, make sure that they work with our apps. And in the video that we just saw, it's been paired with an iPad, and they were using GarageBand to compose a song. And from the software side, all of that stuff is already built in. Apple and Google and Microsoft are already doing a lot in terms of accessibility on their end. And so, then there's hardware manufacturers that are just, complementing each other. And then from, the perspective of a company like ours and the work that I do, we're just ensuring the software that we're building is compatible with all these other things other people are making. Little story about, speaking of Apple, and a little bit of a story about the iPhone. It came out in 2007 and pretty much redefined everything we know about technology. I mean, it redefined, how we handle, all of a sudden we had a pocket computer that could handle email and text message, phone calls, etc. It did an okay job of replacing a bag of devices, calculators, watches, cameras, PDAs, and more. It's been getting better and better ever since. And it really influenced every single smartphone that came after it. It was monumental. However, features like VoiceOver, which is the iPhone screen reader, color inversion for the colorblind, and text zoom for people with low vision didn't ship until the iPhone 3GS in 2009. So that means for 2 years, a whole community of people, several communities, in fact, were left outside of this advancement. So 2 versions of the phone came and went before people with disabilities were given access to this technological marvel. It was an expensive paperweight. People with disabilities weren't buying the iPhone for 2 years because they were kind of left out of that. So I use that as an example of, even Apple, a company that we really respect for design and inclusion, even they didn't really have it together for the first 2 years of the iPhone. I don't work there. I don't know anyone that works there, but I just find that curious that the iPhone, which we really respect as a technological marvel and that completely redefined everything, it took about 2 years until people with disabilities were really included in that, especially those who are blind. So, the last, or this section really goes into kind of my experiences working as a product manager, working with various product and software teams, people who are, product managers themselves, designers, developers, mostly developers, and these are some of the conversations that I've been having just working with people. So one thing that I'll often hear is, I didn't know this had to be accessible, which to me is, it's basically telling me I didn't know this had to work, because once again, everyone has a need for access. And what's the point of designing if we aren't designing for as many people as we can? And designing for accessibility may be the only way some people can experience what you've built. As I mentioned earlier, accessibility is useful, essential for some, but useful for all. Another thing that I heard before is that we understand it's important, but our customers won't pay for accessibility. So, often I've witnessed people, they have this perception that accessibility is something separate for specific people. But as I mentioned, when something is designed universally, it benefits everyone. I made the example of curb cuts, which are made for people in wheelchairs. I also mentioned closed captioning and various things like that. Even email, I think, was invented for people who are deaf because they couldn't use the phone. One thing that often comes up, especially in this space, is the kind of the motivations that get people going and why they want to get into accessibility. And I'd say the number one thing is, at least from my experience, is the legal aspect of it. My first introduction in accessibility was fixing bugs so websites would pass a certain measure of compliance. And so I hear that often from people who are getting into it now, and people who want to say, like, how do we get this to pass compliance? How do we make a compliant website? Is our site accessible, compliant? But now my perspective on that matter is that, we'll build the very best product we can for most people, but when it comes to the people who need us the most, let's do the minimum. Because really, compliance or any legally established minimum is really just the beginning. So meeting legal compliance is doing the bare minimum to avoid lawsuits. If you don't normally do the minimum, don't give your people with disabilities the bare minimum. This next one gets a little bit more into very procedural, kind of agile software development. People will say things like, I know this is an issue, but we don't have the capacity or bandwidth to work on it right now. We'll create a user story and we'll put it in the backlog for prioritization. And what I tend to hear, and I understand the challenges that people are up against, but I do tend to hear that I know my product is useless to some people, but we have things we'd be more important to do for the foreseeable future. There's a couple ways to get around this. Maybe designing with accessibility in mind from the very beginning is great, but then when you do run into an issue, prioritize it. So it's like the original, this is like the software development version of we should really hang out sometime with no further action taken. I just want to say, keep making accessibility a priority. One thing, and this is something that tends to be a bit more of a pet peeve, is people say, is this really an issue when we point out things that are wrong from an accessibility perspective? And what we end up hearing is that this problem doesn't affect the majority. Should I be concerned with a minority? Or to put it another way, how many people does this affect really? Or is this an edge case? If you can't understand or acknowledge there is a problem, it doesn't necessarily make the problem go away. And then defining edge cases or calling things edge cases is really just kind of setting parameters on what you care about. Because, and another thing that I've heard sometimes, and I really don't want to focus on the legal aspect of this stuff, but one thing that some people will say is that it really only takes one person to sue. So, that could be one way of thinking about it. And, we do live in an age where software development is pretty organic. Things come and go. So people will say this feature is going away soon. Do we have to fix it? And my answer would be, the way I would look at that is that if this were any other high priority issue blocking most other users, we fix it. If it were, a non-accessibility bug, or if it were affecting, what you would consider like most other users, how would you treat it? If you'd also ignore it, then I guess maybe it's justified. But as I tell people, is that until you've cleared a path, people must live with the obstruction you left in their way, or they'll move on to something better designed to suit their needs. Competitors, or there's other options out there. There's other people kind of doing similar things. If they're providing a better experience, then they would move on. One thing that I like to say when I have a difficult time with websites or applications or just digital experience in general is like, why if your site isn't working for me, why are you making it so difficult for me to give you my money? And that's the way I look at it. And so, to conclude, just wanted to make a couple points to wrap up. The photo that I have here is, when we lived in South Philly, there'd be people perpetually blocking curb cuts and crosswalks, and it was really frustrating, especially as a new parent who was pushing around a stroller, or really just anyone on foot as a pedestrian. And I use that as an analogy of until we've cleared the path, people kind of have to live with the obstructions or put themselves in maybe someone using a website is not going to go in harm's way, but you have people walking in the street to avoid the car that you've parked there. Even if you think you're only going to be there for a few minutes, somebody has to live with that. And so we think about the blockers that we put up unintentionally or even intentionally in digital experiences. So I always encourage people to empathize with others and really put themselves in their situations and think about how they might be using things. Can also really consider who we're forgetting, so that's not just empathizing with people, that's really thinking about inclusion and how we involve more people. There are numerous tools to aid in design, development testing, quality assurance, all sorts of things. People have written books and articles, and there's lots of websites at our disposal. And I've learned a lot about accessibility in the past couple of years, and most of it is thanks to resources that are just freely available. Research and evaluate high priority concerns. So a lot of this stuff doesn't change overnight, and I don't expect it to. But we can prioritize and kind of move the whole mountain kind of brick by brick or something like that, or move a building brick by brick if we really prioritize and figure out a plan on how we can accomplish the goal. And then get everyone involved. I like to say that it's really, I found that there's an inequity left on people who are doing the engineering aspect, people who are really building the experience, but people who are on the business side can plan around it, can budget things. People like project managers can make sure that people are working on these things. Designers kind of avoiding these, or maybe designing around the problems instead of helping contribute to the issues. And then developers are the ones who really tie everything together. And then there's other folks who are doing testing and really looking for the issues and maybe finding problems before they would get in the hands of customers. And then one thing that we found is that it doesn't matter how many issues that we log or bugs that we file. It's really about the cultural change that needs to happen at an organization, and really thinking about how to approach your business and your product. So that's I think the most challenging aspect, but the aspect that would probably make the biggest sweeping changes in an organization. And so I'm going to leave with a quote from my VP. I mentioned this earlier. Disability isn't the lack of ability, it's the lack of a solution. Thank you. And then have some resources here. I'm Mikey Il on Twitter and other social media. I'm on LinkedIn. I have my email address here, and then you can read more about Comcast accessibility at comcast.com/accessibility.
Well, great. Thank you. If we were in person, I would applaud, but that's not great for the recording. So I will just say that.
There's your one person there.
Yay. But no, I think that was really wonderful. And to kind of start off our discussion, I was really excited to highlight this topic for our group because I think it's super relevant to the work that we do as technical writers and various people who are engaged in creating content for the web in various ways. But I also think it is a great way to kick off our program year for the STC, because I think we have a long way to go in terms of thinking about our own programs and our own conferences and how we can make those more accessible. So
absolutely. Now this is Danielle. I actually have some questions. Ooh,
Yeah,
for Mikey. Part of it is because I actually am on the spectrum. I have Asperger's myself and am the mother of an Asperger's person, and so there was certain things that I know that you definitely covered, but I guess I was kind of more curious about some of the more in-depth information. For example, like for instance, you were saying voice assistant. The first thing that popped into my head was Comcast voice remote control, which I can't make mine work, but that was the first thing that I could think of that Comcast had done. That I was like, oh, that's a cool idea, because I know my husband can never remember the channel number, and so I'm like, that would be great if I could just tell him to say watch House Hunters and he could get right to it or something like that. But my questions had more to do with, first of all, as a technical communicator who works very deeply in accessibility, what do you find is, I mean, I want to put this as diplomatically as possible. What is the one accessibility task that you find to be the most challenging to do? For example, I know that something that's actually easy to do with websites is to add alt tags, so people can see what the images are supposed to be. Then alt tag and say, oh, this is supposed to be a picture of such and such, little things like that. What do you find to be the most challenging thing to try to do when you're creating your UX or your different products?
I'd say the more complex the interface is. So, my experience is very interactive. Alt text is pretty straightforward. I think most people understand the concept of how to use it, what to use it, what's it for. Obviously, there's better alt text, there's worse alt text, but that's pretty straightforward. When it comes to complex interfaces, so if you ever saw something that might have been difficult to use with a keyboard and mouse, from a dexterity perspective of where to click, what to do, if things looked unclear, or from a cognitive perspective, and you looked at a web page and you were like, I'm not really quite sure what to do here. Chances are that it's probably going to be impossible for somebody who has a disability. If they're a keyboard only user, and they can't use their mouse, or they don't use a mouse, it may be very difficult for them. If they're using a screen reader, if they were visually impaired, oftentimes we'll see that experience just comes up blank for them, or they may not be able to use it at all. And that's the difficulty, because people, I think we can, I'm optimistic in the respect that I think we can have it all. I think that we can create experiences that are robust and creative and inspiring. But I'm also, I'm very optimistic, but I also want to include everyone in that experience too, and I don't want to kind of leave people out of that.
Sure.
So we found that there might be interfaces that are really robust and innovative and new, but that really raises the complexity, and oftentimes people will kind of leave other people out of that experience because they just aren't aware of how other people use technology. So it's really case by case. It's not, but I'd say the more complex the interface, the more complex it is for everyone involved.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that really when we're talking about UX, it's not just visual, it's the whole package, because even holding a glass, if it doesn't fit your hand the right way, then it's not usable, sort of thing. So it's really a true look at user experience and how it applies to everything, not just one aspect of it.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool. And the other thing that I was kind of curious about digging a little deeper, as I mentioned, both my son and I are on the autism spectrum, and you mentioned different cognitive accessibility things. Like I said, some of the physical ones are a little bit more obvious, like speech and, if you can't use your hands, you're blind, or you're deaf. What are some of the things that Comcast does, or what have you done in your experience that really address some of those nonverbal disabilities?
Sure. It's interesting you brought up the voice remote. One interesting benefit of the new web remote that we have that's specifically designed for people using eye control, and that's kind of how it was marketed. It allows you type in the voice remote input if you pull up this web remote on a computer. So it's interesting that we have, we've kind of like duplicated technology, and it's still quote unquote the voice input, but you're actually typing it in, which I found to be really interesting. So now people who are nonverbal for any reason do have a way to actually type in voice input commands to their cable box, which I found very interesting.
Right.
So that's really cool. But the voice remote overall was like definitely helps folks out on across neurodiversity. But the interesting thing about the voice remote, which is a cool story, is that it wasn't specifically designed with accessibility in mind, but I think people instantly recognize how much of an impact it could make. One thing that I point out is that, like, my mom has severe arthritis, and maybe using all the buttons on the remote may prove difficult, but she can press the one button and speak into it. And that technology is getting better all the time.
Right.
Yeah. So and what you said is true. Some of the stuff with other disabilities tends to be a little bit.
It's like the first thing I thought of was like dyslexia and visual things, or like my son doesn't have dyslexia, but he does have not dysmorphia. He has where he has a hard time with converting what he's thinking into writing. So like he uses a keyboard because it's easier than actual handwriting. And I found that one of the advantages of me being a technical writer is that once I start writing on a typewriter, it was a lot faster for me as well. So there's things like that, and I'm kind of wondering, is that part of like how you design the UX, is that you're trying to make it as accessible as possible so it's very organized and easy for anybody to look at?
Yeah, I often point people who are, especially if they're coming from the content end of things, to really just use plain language.
Yeah,
to really
absolutely.
think about how, and it's not, one thing that people have this misconception of too is that like accessibility means like lowering the bar, or kind of like quote unquote even, and I hesitate to even say this because you're dumbing it down, but you're not. You're making it more inclusive. You're broadening the scope of in which you're able to reach to people. You're avoiding, complex and stuffy terms. And I'm a pretty technical person. I've always been. But it's also just a lot easier to read things that are written in a simple manner. You're broadening your base. You're opening it up to people who speak English as a second language, people with comprehension
That's what I was about to
difficulty.
say. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also, another thing that I like to do, like suggest when it comes to accessibility, is providing things multimodal. Because let's say, for example, I'm listening to or let's say I wanted to get into podcasts, or podcast sounded interesting to me, but I'm hard of hearing. So the podcasts that I would really be a big fan of are the ones that go the extra length and are able to provide transcripts, which you really don't see too often in that medium, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I know,
think like TED Talks do it, for example. You can always read the TED Talks later, and
exactly.
they always have the captions, because sometimes, again, like you said, situational disabilities. You're at work, you want to watch a TED Talk or something like that, but you don't want to be disturbing everybody around you. You could just be reading the closed caption and still getting an idea of what's going on. Or if you don't have time to do that, you could always be reading the transcript later.
Exactly. Yeah, it's multimodal. And then it's better for archiving. You can and there's another thing too, like in terms of like sharing, and if you want people to really access your content, like I can't really copy and paste you a quote from an audio only recording that I heard, but I could, if there's a transcript, I could send a snippet your way that you might enjoy, and then it'll maybe lead you to listen to the whole thing or read the whole transcript. So and it's also indexable by search engines. And I always say that too, like multimodal, even when you're thinking about, so say if you were sharing some graphics and charts and graphs and such, and you really wanted to use red and green for whatever reason. Most people with color blindness have red and green color blindness, so red and green would be very difficult for them to discern the difference of. But if you had provided just that information in a plain table format, that would be accessible for people who may not be able to see the graph, because they're colorblind or low vision or completely blind, or maybe cognitively people might not like a graph, depending on what kind of graph it is, could be really hard for people to understand. Some people may just be able to process the raw numbers a little bit easier.
That makes sense. Does it ever feel very difficult that you're trying to, like you said, you've got people who've got color blindness, you've got people who might have hard of hearing, you might have all these different things. Like you said, there could be people who have multiple things going on, and you're trying to, like you said, it is difficult to try to hit all of them. Have you ever found a problem in trying to like please as many people as possible and still missing the mark? Because it sounds like there's just so many things going on. It's like I would not always remember about the color blindness, for example. It's like, oh, geez, I wanted to get Christmas colors on, but oh, now Mikey mentioned that I should probably try to use some different colors. Oh my gosh, sometimes it just sounds like it might be overwhelming.
Yeah, there's definitely a certain component to that. I think some aspects, especially if you're getting into this stuff for the first time and you're really trying to be more inclusive, it can feel a little overwhelming. We tend, and even I personally just tend to maintain that I try to do the best job possible to accommodate more people than I would have otherwise if I hadn't been thinking about other people's needs. So we really just aim to kind of just do our best and iterate and adapt where possible. But I do think there is maybe a certain level of the seesaw effect where like something might improve for somebody but might be worse for somebody else. But I think that we're still better for it by trying to accommodate as many people as possible, kind of just like into what I said about people who might have some criticisms about dumbing things down. I think if we're trying to be more inclusive, then we're, the net gain there is that we're just reaching more people than we would have otherwise been had we not been thinking about this stuff.
Right. I think that was even like one of the criticisms of like iPhones originally. Everybody said, oh, it seems too simple. And yet it's a pretty popular phone, and took off like wildfire. So much for dumbing down, So that's what Apple's very famous for, is trying to keep things simple and accessible just for everybody, not just for disabilities, but just easy to use.
Precisely, yeah. I mean, definitely been a key to their success.
Yep, cool. Okay, well, I think that's all my questions. Thank you.
Did anyone else want to jump in with a question? I particularly appreciated the section on conversations, because I think my main question about all of this would be, in my position, and I imagine this is the case for a lot of people in our membership, you're a writer working with a team of designers and people who are content experts and various other things. And like, you don't have a dedicated accessibility specialist. So if you're interested in this, how do you like start the most basic conversation and begin to advocate for it? And do you have any particular resources that you would point someone to if they're interested in going deeper in this stuff?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things that I can point to. One thing that I've heard, and I forget where they originally heard this, is that a lot of people aren't as lucky as I am in the position that I am. I think our team could definitely be bigger. I feel like sometimes we're up to our necks in stuff sometimes. But most places don't have kind of a dedicated accessibility team or even one accessibility person. But it depends on how you look at it. The one thing that we really want to get, the point that we really want to get is that everybody's kind of the accessibility person, regardless of the role that you're doing. But it does sometimes come down to one person to really champion this idea that we're going to be more inclusive and that we're going to really diversify, what we think of our audience, and really include people and figure out a way that we can get people trained and understand how they can contribute to this effort, whether they're a writer or designer or developer. And so a couple things that I like to point out is that there's a couple sites like Web Accessibility. WebAIM is good, so that's WEBAIM.org. So that stands for Web Accessibility in Mind. They're a great resource for all things web accessibility. There's also the Web Accessibility Initiative. So those are the folks who are really creating the guidelines and kind of the metrics that we tend to aim for. So they have their guidelines are divided across 3 kind of conformance levels. So there's like A, AA, and AAA, which is like the highest level of web accessibility conformance. And in many ways, some of the most difficult place to arrive. At our organization and most places, people are really just trying to get to a AA standard. This isn't a legal requirement or anything, but a lot of people do use the WCAG or WCAG, the web accessibility, the web content accessibility guidelines as the metric when they do formulate laws. So if legal is something that you're interested in learning, the guidelines are a good place to start because a lot of laws are typically formulated around the web content accessibility guidelines, and you can find that if you look up the Web Accessibility Initiative. So those are the folks really putting it together. Another thing that I'd like to add is if you're really into open source software development, or just if you also want to contribute any writing or articles or thoughts on this stuff or join a conversation, there's a11yproject.com. It's also a good place to find out about local events and conferences and such. And A11Y is often used in the tech space as a numeronym, a bit of an abbreviation for accessibility. There are 11 characters between A and Y in the word accessibility, so it's often abbreviated in tech spaces as A11Y. And so those are pretty much the recommendations that I would make off the top of my head.
Great, thank you. And I guess in some cases, it can be as simple probably as just, when you're in a meeting preparing for it. Like in my job, I work in fundraising for Penn, and we have all of these campaign events that we're lining up, and they always involve like video content. And I'm thinking now, I'm like, what do we do for people who can't access that, via vision or hearing? And I guess part of it is just starting by like raising those questions for people.
Yeah. I like to tell people that, very much what you said. It really sometimes you get started by just asking that question, like what are we doing for people who may have this disability or impairment, or like what are we doing, or even asking, is this accessible, which could mean a number of things. So and that definitely gets the conversation going.
Yeah, a ton of food for thought here on those lines.
Absolutely.
Did anyone want to pipe in with any last thoughts or comments? All right, well, thank you again, Mikey. You are welcome to come back anytime. We have a conference in April where we have a whole slew of panels, so I'm sure Danielle will second that if you want to join us again.
I will, especially as the conference chair, yeah.
Yeah, we would love to have you. Thank you for giving us your time and your expertise. And to everyone else, please stay tuned for our upcoming events. I think our next one is on October 9th. That's another webinar that we are co-hosting with the New England chapter of the Society for Technical Communication. And then we've got a networking coming up at the end of October on the 22nd. So if you're on our mailing list, you I think already got some emails about those, but we'll certainly get more, and you can always check out our website. What was that?
I said, and if you're not on our mailing list, get on it so you can find out what's going on.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, thank you again, Mikey, and thank you to everyone who joined us, and have a great evening.
Great, thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.